Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, I'm Colonie Town Judge Peter Crummey, and welcome to Benchmark. We'll explore a variety of issues involving our legal system, our justice system, and how they intersect with the citizens of the town of Colonie. Today, we're very fortunate to have as our guest a real property tax expert. All of us understand and realize, whether we be homeowner or a renter, the impact of real property taxes on our financial arena. And we're going to find out more about the real property tax system and what can be done about it here today. I'd like to welcome Tom Griffin, attorney. Welcome, Tom. How are you?
Thank you, Judge.
And Tom, it's so great to have you here, especially at this time of year, because so many people are hearing about their own taxes, real property taxes, assessments, and the like. And it's always a timely subject, no matter when we can approach it. And we're lucky that you're going to share some of your wisdom today about the tax system in general. And you have a fantastic background and experience altogether, and I think that our town residents will be pleased to know, first of all, that not only are you a practicing attorney in the real property tax arena, but also for 10 years you served as executive director of the office, the New York State Office of Real Property Tax Services. And no doubt that provided you great insight as well. And tell us about your experience with the New York State Office of Real Property Tax Services first.
Well, I do think it does give me a unique perspective on the property tax system. The Office of Real Property Services was formerly known as the Division of Equalization and Assessment. I was executive director of that for 10 years, and the job of the agency is, to the extent that the legislature has delegated its constitutional obligation, its job is to oversee, supervise, and equalize assessments in New York State. In terms of overseeing and supervising, the agency really plays two roles, two different kinds of roles, I should say. One is regulatory in nature and does equalization rates, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to get into that. But it also provides support to localities as they attempt to assess properties in town. And that will include providing the software to localities so that they can go about publishing the assessment rolls and the tax rolls. It involves helping through regional offices, assessor's office, in doing their jobs. It involved providing advisory appraisals for some of the more complex properties that local assessors by themselves may not have the resources to do, and otherwise help the locality, not just the assessor's office, but the towns, to deal with the many issues having to do with real property tax. There's also legal staff that helps with local government officials in dealing with property tax issues as they come up. And there are many. I believe you have in front of you the volumes of real property tax law in McKinney's, and there are what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's a lot of there are a lot of laws, and every year there are new laws that are passed involving real property tax, and so it's necessary that localities have some help. The other thing that the agency does is equalize. Provides equalization rates, and I don't know whether now you want to get into that, or it might be easier to get into that as we talk a little bit more about how the system works.
Well, and that's fine, and it is a very involved system, and I thought it would be helpful for all of us to see what the current New York State law is on the subject of real property tax. And of course, as Tom Griffin has pointed out, there's no less than 5 volumes of state law on the issue, and obviously ever growing in that way. And it impacts all of us, the property tax system. And we read about it all the time, and we know that our town residents are paying property taxes for town and county in January, and again faced with a school tax that's due in September every year. And it continues to, it appears to all that it continues to rise. What generates why we as citizens believe that the property taxes just continue to rise?
Well, I know that many assessors pull their hair out about this because assessors feel as though they're blamed more often than they ought to be. But the fact of the matter is that the increases in taxes are attributable to a number of things, but for the most part are either a function of the assessment or are a function of the tax levy. Now, the tax levies, of course, are levied every year by the taxing jurisdictions where the property is located. This would involve the school district, would involve the town or city in which the property is located, and will involve the county. It could also involve library districts and other districts, but for the most part, the tax levies that we're talking about today are the tax levies of the schools, towns, and the counties. In essence, every year, each of these taxing jurisdictions must determine what it needs to spend in the ensuing year, what its other revenues are going to be, and the difference is what is called the levy, is the amount that has to be raised in property taxes. Now, how does it raise that in property taxes? It must have a fair way of assessing that property tax or levying that property tax among all the properties in town. And it's the assessor's job in the town to do the assessments. We all have a general sense of what that involves. That involves a determination of what the value of property is. In essence, then what happens is all of the property value in the town is tallied up. Determination is made as to how many thousands of dollars there are in the in the taxing jurisdiction. And then the tax rate is set. So the tax rate is how many dollars that taxing jurisdiction is going to assess per property owner for every $1,000 of value that is put on the property by the assessor. So that's the difference between the assessment and the tax. They're two different things. The assessment drives to some degree increases if there's an increase in the assessment. The tax levy will drive an increase in tax to the extent that there's an increase in the tax levy. There are other factors which make it very tricky and difficult for assessors and tax jurisdictions to tell any particular tax owner what their tax bill will be in the ensuing year, and that relates in part to how these taxes are allocated. For example, in the case of school taxes and counties, how these taxes are allocated amongst the various towns and parts of towns within the school district and within the county.
And of course, one of the key legs to that whole operation is what the legislative bodies, whether it be school district or town board or county legislature, what they think they need to support their own spending habits as well, which continues to drive increases as well in what leaves a family's home every year to go to pay their tax bill. And it hasn't overall, it certainly hasn't been shrinking, and nor has spending been shrinking by any taxing authority. It doesn't appear to our citizens here as well, regardless of the taxing entity. More than 20 years ago, I served as a town attorney here in Colonie, and one of my assignments was to represent the town assessor's office. And routinely, I found myself defending the town in connection with either its commercial assessments or its residential assessments. Mm-hmm. And during that period of time in the early 80s, in order for a resident to challenge their property tax assessment, they had to utilize the same legal format as set forth through New York state law, as a commercial owner would have to use, thereby making it rather onerous for a resident to actually effectively challenge their assessment in court. They could always take their case to the Assessment Review Board, but if they wanted to challenge their decision, they would land up in court with significant fees and expenses in that way. And a change came in the mid-'80s as well, and some people have considered that format now. And what is that change that now a resident can enjoy if they want to challenge their assessment?
Up to a point, a resident can challenge his or her assessment if he's not satisfied with the decision by the Board of Assessment Review in what's called a small claims hearing, SCAR hearing. The Office of Court Administration appoints people who are familiar with the value of real property, have had some experience in real property tax arena to hear appeals. But the first step, and we can talk about this in more detail later, but the first step actually for anybody that's interested in their assessment should be looking now at their assessment, at the assessment roll in the town, because the tentative assessment rolls were published May 1. And taxpayers have until May 27th to file a form, which they can find on ORP's website if they would like. They, if they're asked to, have to appear before the Board of Assessment Review. This is a board that comprised of 3 people that are locally selected. Then, if they're not satisfied with that, rather than go to court, as you suggested was changed in the 80s, they can now, for a nominal amount, I think of $25, argue why their assessment should be reduced to a single small claims hearing officer. However, it should be understood by whoever makes that election that there is no appeal beyond that to the court system, so that really a decision has to be made if someone isn't happy with their assessment at the decision of the Board of Assessment Review as to whether or not they want to throw their lot in with the SCAR hearing officer or go to court. As you say, going to court is expensive, the procedures are strict, an appraisal is required.
Well, that's true, and I recall representing the assessor as we made that transition to a small claims format to benefit the citizens. And but still, even at that time, there were really 10 or 20 maximum challenges at that time during the 80s in the town of Colonie, for instance. And when you consider that we have about 25,000 total parcels in this town, including commercial, that it still was something that suggested that at that time things were somewhat in order at that particular point. And but there are times when there are significant changes which cause more reviews, I'm sure, over time, and it will continue, I suppose, in that way. In Colonie, too, Tom, we hear a lot about homestead, non-homestead. How come there's a different rate? What a homestead, the residents pay one rate. Can you help us and explain what the difference is between homestead and non-homestead tax assessments?
Well, homestead, non-homestead is relate to provisions in state law which allow for a locality to adopt to be a homestead or a non-homestead community. And that simply means that they wish to tax their single-family homes at a different rate from other properties. And that rate, in order to do that, the town must be at 100% full value. They must be in a situation where they're assessing at full value, so that there's an easy way to understand the impact of having a higher rate for certain kinds of property as opposed to other kinds of property. That's really all there is to it.
So that distinction is provided by state law, and because we didn't always have that in Colonie, as I recall.
That's right, and it's solely a function of the tax rate, has nothing to do with the assessment. The assessment is going to be what the assessment should be. It's the application of the tax rate to that assessment that makes the difference in the two classes.
Do you feel that there's any basis for the notion of having homestead versus non-homestead? Well, I guess the first question is, does it result in a commercial property paying more tax on their assessment than a homeowner would with the same assessment?
I don't want to put a number on it, but there are more than a handful of the 1,100 assessing units in the state that have homestead, non-homestead, not that many, probably fewer than 50, and I don't know of anywhere the tax rate for the commercial property is less than the tax rate for the residential property. So it's, for the most part, intended to, I suppose, increase the tax rate for businesses who may be perceived as having the ability to pay to a greater extent than the residential homeowner. Although we haven't talked about this, but there are a lot of assessments that are, exemptions that are available for business taxpayers, but certainly residential taxpayers, including the STAR exemption. There's a veterans exemption. There's an aged exemption. There's exemption for persons with disabilities. There are, you name it, there's an exemption for about every difficulty one faces in life.
And I recall when I was a town attorney in Colonie that the town board would, with state authority, adopt there was a local option exemption often, where the state legislature would say, you can do this if you want.
That's right.
And oftentimes the town would also elect to do that.
You're right. There are only certain kinds of exemptions that a municipality must accept. STAR's one, but otherwise, the Constitution provides that a locality will exempt educational, philanthropic, and charitable, I believe is the word they use. There may be another term there too, but otherwise, for the most part, exemptions are optional with the localities. I will say most every locality elects into the exemptions to one degree or another.
Now, you mentioned earlier, and you've referred to a website, the ORPS website. Is that the Office of Real Property Services website? And would citizens not only be able to find information about small claims assessment review proceedings there, would they also be able to find information about exemptions, local exemptions there? Or is that solely driven out of the local assessor's office?
No, I think certainly the local assessor's office is a place to inquire. The Office of Real Property Services website, though, is pretty rich. It has a knowledge database, has a search engine. I've done it, I don't know how many times since I've left the agency. If you typed in exemption, veterans, you'd come up with 15 hits that would help you and probably even give you a form.
Well, that's a great help too, knowing that that's all available and in that way. Now, oftentimes we'll hear about education expenses, and people will say, gee, I thought the lottery was paying for all of education, and what's going on with all that money? And then others will suggest that, well, actually, a lot of property tax, a significant amount of property tax, is also funding education. What say you?
Well, there's no question a lot of property tax is funding education. In fact, it varies from place to place, downstate to upstate, but I mean around here as a rule, your property tax that goes toward the school is 50 to 60% of your total tax bill. The local town tax, city tax is 5 to 8%, something in that range, and the balance is county tax. So, and school taxes are continuing to go up property taxes in general are going up, but it seems as though school taxes are going up at a higher rate. And in fact, since 2001, between 2001 and 2006, the Office of State Controller reported in a report that taxes had increased over the last 5 years 42%, whereas the cost of living or inflation was only 13%. So property taxes are going up at quite a greater rate than is the general rate of inflation, especially over the last 5 years.
How does New York compare to other states as to taxing? We'll often hear that New York State is one of the most taxed states in the country. What do you say about that?
Well, again, referring to a 2006 report from the Office of the State Comptroller, New York taxes are 49% higher than the national average. Property taxes as a share of personal income are 28% higher than other states. So the taxes, the raw absolute numbers are show that we pay 49% more than the average taxpayer across the country. But in terms of one's income, it's not quite as bad. We're only 29% higher than the average taxpayer across the country. Of course, it varies so much from states that have no property tax to states that are immediately surrounding New York. For example, New Jersey, where property taxes are probably higher. I think New York taxes are not the property taxes are not they are not the highest, nor are its income taxes the highest. It's the sort of combination of all the taxes that put us in the top quartile. But property taxes alone are a significant factor. Other states, though, have personal property tax. New York does not have personal property tax, so it's often difficult to compare. It's apples and oranges in some cases, but I think it's fair to say that the taxes in New York State are higher than other states.
Are there other methods of assessing for purposes of property tax other than the method that New York State seems to have developed over the years?
The development of the way New York conducts its property tax administration is a very interesting story, really. New York State was like virtually every other state in the Union and every other country in the world that has what's called an ad valorem tax. That law was simply that assessments were to be at market value. In the early 70s, that law was honored for the most part in the breach only, and assessments were at a fraction of full value. So, in fact, it was very difficult for anybody to tell whether they were being fairly assessed or not. In the early 70s, a professor by the name of Hellerstein, in a famous case, brought a proceeding against the town of Islip assessment roll and claimed that the law meant what it said, that his property, along with all the other properties in the town of Islip and in the state of New York, should be assessed at market value, which was the language of Section 306 of the real property tax law in those days. It went to the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York, and the Court of Appeals decided that before December 31st of the year 1976, the town of Islip and others were concerned that they would have to do the same, would have to assess properties at full value. I would characterize this from my unique perspective as a bit of a purist, a sad day when the New York State Legislature, in fact, over the veto of then Governor Carey, repealed Section 306 that would have required the assessment at market value, and in 3 sentences changed the law in New York. And those 3 sentences, almost verbatim, although not quite this way, say that properties within a town must be uniform, must be fair within the town. However, the second sentence says that they can be at a fraction of full value. And in case that wasn't clear, the third said that you can do pretty much what you have been doing if you want to. So that is the current state of the law in New York. Real property tax, Section 305, 1, 2, and 3 are the 3 sentences that I summarized.
Well, it did have an impact, and the state legislation did as well. Representing our assessor's office years ago, and there was a lot of discussion about we were not at 100% valuation at the time. And there was concern that without that state legislation that there would be an upheaval in the administration of assessments in the town and other towns throughout the state and city as well. And I bet the state legislature to some degree was responding to local concerns about what might happen if actually they had to somehow comply with the strict mandate of the Court of Appeals decision. But nonetheless, Colonie did venture into 100% valuation and some years after, and made an effort to convert to that compliance with that notion as well, and that was quite a process as well. It probably brought more evenness and fairness to the situation at the time, wherein they believed overall that what would happen is 1/3 of the taxpayers would actually pay less tax based on the new system, 1/3 would stay the same, and actually 1/3 would see an increase, and probably based primarily on a re-evaluation of their property, which hadn't been done sometimes for 20 or 30 years.
Well, I think I remember, in fact, I looked at ORP's website this morning to see the equalization rate history of the town of Colonie, and I saw that before the reassessment that occurred during your years, the equalization rate was about 4%, so that meant that the assessor was assessing at 4% of full value, which is a good indication that a reassessment had not occurred for many years. And in fact, in Westchester County, the equalization rates down there, as determined by ORPS, are below 1%. That is to say, because reassessment has not occurred in so long, assessments down there of, let's just say, a $400,000 property, an assessment there would be below 1% of that, so $4,000, $3,927. And it's interesting because when you get such small numbers, a difference of $10 in your assessment makes more difference than it would otherwise seem.
That's correct.
If you're assessed at $3,900 as opposed to $390,000, and your assessment is increased to $3,950, the actual relative increase does not appear as clear as it would if the assessment were increased from $390,000 to $395,000, let's say.
Tom, all of us as citizens and property taxpayers, whether you're a homeowner or whether you're renting, that property tax is still part of your financial arena. Any efforts being made here at the Capitol to change the way business has been done in real property tax historically?
Yes, there is a commission that was appointed by the governor. It's called the Commission on Property Tax Relief. It's chaired by a man by the name of Tom Suozzi, who is the county executive, I believe, of Nassau County. And I think they're quite serious about trying to propose some reforms. They've had a number of meetings throughout the state, have taken testimony, and are scheduled to make a report sometime this year. Whether or not that report will have any traction in the state legislature, it's hard to know. I do know because for 10 years, every Friday morning, I would look at the legislation that was proposed, that there is, it seems, ever-increasing pressure for the legislature to do something about property tax. Unfortunately, often the recommendations are even at odds. The system is difficult, counterintuitive, and the problem, frankly, is with property tax is it's too high. There have been proposals to try to fund the biggest user of the property tax, schools, through other means, but I want the listeners to know, and my number is a little old, this may not be current, but I remember when I was in the agency that the amount of money, that the portion of all the income tax that's raised from taxpayers in New York and all the property taxes that are raised from taxpayers in New York that goes to schools, that went to school districts, was 45%. So the state is contributing about half of the school taxes budget to schools as it is in the billions of dollars, and I don't have that figure off the top of my head.
Is that what we hear annually about school aid? That is driven directly from the state legislature.
That's right.
School aid, and they do school runs down at the legislature when they're developing the budget. So that's state funds in addition to the local property tax.
That's right. And if there's going to be relief from property tax, something has to be done to help the schools, or other proposals are, as I say, those that some run counter. Some are help the schools more. Some proposals are in that vein. Other proposals are to cap the school taxes in some way. When STAR was first proposed, it included a provision which would have capped school tax at a certain limit. There are reforms that have occurred in other states. One of the best examples, I think, is Prop 2.5. People may have heard of in Massachusetts, although I know that there is some stress put upon localities. But in that state, there is a cap on property tax equal to 2.5% of the full value of the roll, of the assessment roll. So the people in town can only be responsible for taxes to the taxing jurisdiction equal to 2.5% of the value, and increase from one year to the next in the levy can be no more than 2.5%. There are other reforms. One in California called Prop 13 is generally not thought to be as successful nor fair. It essentially says that reassessments will only occur as to properties that are recently transferred. And until they're transferred, they're not to be touched, again, without some exceptions. But property tax rates there are capped at 1%, whereas in New York, they're anywhere between roughly 2 and 4%. So there's substantial relief for property tax out there. That has mixed reviews in terms of its fairness and in terms of what it's doing to localities.
Well, we all know how significant this issue is for all of us, and we all know, too, how vital it is for every community to have a viable school and school district. And one of my favorite bumper stickers of all time was, if you think education's expensive, try ignorance. And so many of us have to come together to focus on spending and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And you've accomplished so much with us today. Tom, in closing, what are you doing now as a practicing attorney?
Well, I focus my practice on property tax, having been involved for 10 years. It's an abiding interest of mine, and I like to do it because it gives me an opportunity to help taxpayers, whether they're residential or commercial taxpayers, not only in the traditional challenging of assessments, requesting reductions, but also in seeing if there's any way to work with localities, or on the other side of the table with businesses who are undertaking projects, so that some measure of relief might be afforded for a project. So I enjoy very much working in the property tax arena, and appreciate the time I had in the position I had at ORPS, and I thank you very much for letting me talk about it today. Well,
we're thrilled to have you, and you're just another credit to the town of Colonie, and of course your service on behalf of the citizens of the state of New York will never be forgotten. And we're very fortunate that we've been joined by Tom Griffen today to share some information about real property tax here in the state of New York. I'm Judge Peter Crummey, and thank you for joining me on Benchmark.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.